It's been more than 100 years since Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens. But despite a century of being American, Puerto Rico still isn't a state. Why is that the case? And should they be? George Laws Garcia is the executive director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, and he joins the podcast to make the case for Puerto Rican statehood. We talk about Puerto Rico's history and how they ended up in the situation they're in now, what the lack of statehood means for their economy and their people, how Puerto Ricans feel about becoming a state, and whether or not that could realistically happen anytime soon. As always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, leave us a comment, a rating, give a recommendation to a friend. All those things are appreciated. If you really want to support the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/newliberalpodcast. You can also support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Patreon supporters and members get access to our exclusive community Slack, bonus episodes, and so much more. Thanks again for listening, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is George Laws Garcia. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a really interesting topic, Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico sits in a very interesting space in America in that it's not quite a state. You know, there's a sense in which it's America, but not America in a complicated way. And I know we're going to get into that and all the details involved in that. And I'm very interested to kind of dig into the Puerto Rican experience and the arguments for statehood. But before we get into all of that, I'm sure you spend a lot of time thinking about Puerto Rico personally and professionally. But there's a lot of people out there listening who may not know much about Puerto Rico at all. So can we dig into the history of how Puerto Rico became part of America in the first place? Can we set some context for, why is Puerto Rico even part of the United States? How did this end up happening? And how did we get to where we are today?
Definitely. So Puerto Rico is an island in the Caribbean. It's part of the Greater Antilles, a smallest island in the Greater Antilles. So it's close to Dominican Republic, to the east of Dominican Republic. And Puerto Rico is an island that was colonized originally by Spain, starting in 1493. And the original Taino native inhabitants essentially became colonized by Spain. And it was a very powerful and important part of the Spanish Empire because of its key strategic location in the center of the Caribbean that allowed a lot of the ships that were coming from Europe to stop over in Puerto Rico and then on their way to the rest of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And then as those ships were coming back, a lot of times with gold and silver and other products on their way to Europe, they'd stop in Puerto Rico, heading back to Spain and to other places in Europe, which is part of the reason why the name Puerto Rico is developed, because it literally means rich port. So in 1898, when the United States was in an effort to grow its presence at a global level, there was a war that happened with Spain, the Spanish-American War. And as a result of that war, the United States basically acquired several territories from Spain that were former Spanish colonies, and that included Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And actually, this year marks the 125th year of the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, which was the official treaty where Congress essentially annexed Puerto Rico and made it a part of the United States. And under the U.S. Constitution, the different jurisdictions that are recognized are states, obviously, because we're the United States of America, the District of Columbia, which is its own, separate jurisdiction, the seat of government of the United States, and then everything else are pretty much territories. And the territories are possessions of the United States. It means that they belong to the United States, and they're essentially seen as real estate. And for most of American history, there was something called the Northwest Ordinance, which was this document that established that after the 13 colonies, all these territories were being acquired in order to eventually make them states and make them a full part of the Union, because the original founders of the United States hated colonialism. They fought the revolution against it, and they enshrined in the Declaration of Independence this idea of government by the consent of the governed. So the goal was that they would acquire new territories. Those territories would grow in population. Eventually, they'd reach a point where they were ready for statehood, and then Congress would admit them into statehood. And that all changed in the early 1900s, when after these new set of territories that were outside of the continental United States were acquired through this act of war in the Spanish-American War, and the Supreme Court had a series of cases called insular cases, and through these cases they basically decided that the Constitution didn't have to fully apply in the new territories, that Congress could choose what elements of the U.S. Constitution applied there, and then also that the new territories weren't automatically in a trajectory to become a state. So it kind of opened up this space for America to essentially have, permanent, territorial colonies. And that's the situation that the people of Puerto Rico have been in now for 125 years.
And I think, we can talk about the constitutionality and the acts and we can get real technical if we want. I do think it's worth pointing out that this process happened at exactly the time that, we started getting territories that were not filled with, the typical U.S. population at the time of white European descended people. But all of a sudden, the United States had these populations that were non-English speaking, non-white in many instances. And the realpolitik of this is that that's when the U.S. government decided, well, let's hold on the statehood thing.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because when you look back at the historical record, both in Congress and in the Supreme Court decisions, you see that a lot of the fundamentally racist logic that was applied in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, for example, where the Supreme Court decided that as long as you're equal, it's okay to be separate, right? So a lot of that fundamentally racist logic was applied to the U.S. territories to justify this form of territorial colonialism, where Congress could basically govern them without the people having any consent, but also not having any kind of eventually path out of colonial territorialism. They were called alien races. They were called, had foreign customs. There was direct references to, they couldn't understand Anglo-Saxon values, and that makes absolutely no sense.
It's very nice. Yeah. I won't say nice. Nice is the wrong word, but I'll say it's very convenient that when back then they didn't bother to disguise their racism because they weren't ashamed of it, and it's convenient for us that we can actually just look back and say, oh yeah, they were very clear about why that happened, and it's at least like it's upfront, which, we can at least learn from today. But so that's how, Puerto Rico got in the situation it's in, and that's where Puerto Rico has been, I believe, mostly unchanged in status for decades and decades, if not the better part of a century. And in that time, there's, of course, been conversations from Puerto Ricans especially, but also in the rest of America, should Puerto Rico become a state? Should Puerto Rico just kind of exist in this limbo forever, or should Puerto Rico become a state? And this mostly centers around Puerto Rico because, I don't know the exact statistics, but if there's like 4.5 million people or something who live in U.S. territories, like 4 out of the 4.5 million live in Puerto Rico. It's by far the biggest, most populated territory the U.S. has. So all the conversation centers there. I want to ask, what is the history of specifically the statehood movement in Puerto Rico, or alternatively, just conversations about the status in general? If there's been an independence movement, I'd also be interested in learning about that. But the conversations that Puerto Ricans have about this, when did that start to become a big topic, and how long have they been talking about it?
Sure. So in terms of population, you're 100% right. Puerto Rico has about 98% of the population of U.S. citizens living in U.S. territories. And unfortunately, the population of Puerto Rico in the 2000s was close to 4 million. It was 3.9 million. But over the last couple of decades, it's actually fallen down to 3.2 million. And the main reason for that is because one of the features of territorial colonialism is, on one side, political disenfranchisement. So you actually don't have representatives or senators in Congress that you vote for that are accountable to you, and you can't vote for president. And then on the other side, you have inequality, which is a fundamental challenge, because how are you supposed to, develop your economy, grow your standard of living if Congress at any time can treat the U.S. citizens in the territories unequally for any given, purpose. And both of those things have had huge impacts on our population, which has gone down to now 3.2 million, which is devastating because it's literally tearing apart families and communities.
I mean, they're not to be flippant, but all the Puerto Ricans live up here with me in New York.
Yeah,
it's something like, tell me if I've got this wrong, but I think New York City is actually the largest Puerto Rican city in the world, in that there are more Puerto Ricans living in New York than there are Puerto Ricans living in any individual city in Puerto Rico, and like by a lot, I think.
Definitely. So one of the things that's really interesting about that is New York as a state has, I think, the second largest Puerto Rican population now, but for many decades, it was the largest Puerto Rican population, but it's over 1 million Puerto Ricans living in New York state. And New York City itself definitely has, I think, upwards of 700 or 800,000 Puerto Ricans living there. Florida has since surpassed New York as the state with the highest Puerto Rican population. I think there are about 1.2 million Puerto Ricans living in Florida nowadays. But in total, there's about close to 6 million Puerto Ricans living across the United States. And they're not just in New York and Florida. They're in Ohio, they're in Georgia, they're in South Carolina, North Carolina. My mom lives in Washington State with her, husband. We've got family in California. They're all over the place.
But so I did get us off track, though, with that kind of interjection. So, but we were talking about kind of the history of the conversation about, should we be a state? Should we be independent? When did that, obviously right after the Spanish-American War, nobody was talking about that. They were owned by somebody else, and now you're owned by a different colonial power, and it probably took some time to develop. When did that conversation actually start to kind of really become prominent?
So when Puerto Rico was acquired, most of the people on the island saw the United States as coming in as a liberating force. They saw the liberal and democratic values of the United States, a country that had fought a revolution against an oppressive colonial, power, that they'd fought a civil war which expanded the rights and, civil rights and liberties of, minority communities, and of African Americans specifically. And they saw this with hope, that they believed that, Puerto Rico would be treated well and fairly. And that all changed in the period from 1900 through 1917. We had a couple of major developments. One was the passage of the Foraker Act, which was the first organic law that established the government in Puerto Rico. And the governor was appointed by the president. Puerto Ricans had representatives in a lower house, House of Representatives, but the governing council, this essentially the Senate, was all appointed by the governor. So you really had a kind of anti-democratic local governance structure that was imposed on the people of Puerto Rico, who before that they were subjects of the Spanish empire, but they had achieved a level of local self-governance that was significant. And people had there were people with a lot of, intellectual capacity and, knowledge, and they really took offense to that. So that's where a lot of the conversations began. In the statehood movement itself, one of the founding fathers of the statehood movement, an African-American or Afro-Hispanic doctor named Jose Celso Barbosa, he really looked at the Republican Party at that time, which was an abolitionist party, as a huge kind of, progressive force in helping to expand the freedoms and liberties and inclusion of otherwise marginalized groups. So he founded the Republican Statehood Party to essentially group together all the Puerto Ricans who, now we were part of the United States. Like, let's fully become citizens, and then let's eventually become a state. And there was always a significant independence movement on the island. The Spanish had, trampled that movement, and heavily limited it. So, when the United States took over, most people were thinking that Puerto Rico either became a state, or eventually the United States would, kind of liberate Puerto Rico and make it its own independent country. And that's when that debate was essentially kind of, birthed. In 1917, there was a major piece of legislation passed called the Jones-Shafroth Act, which granted United States citizenship to the people of Puerto Rico. And, most people on the island immediately thought that this meant that, we were kind of on track to eventually become a state, because why would the United States grant citizenship to people on the island if it didn't intend for us to, be full participants?
Now, wait, this is not the same as the Jones Act, is it?
So that Jones Act that you're talking about is related to coastwise shipping. That's a separate topic.
Yeah, I just heard you say the Jones and Something Else Act, and I just want you to know, this is, if you want to attack the Jones Act, this is a safe space. This is an anti-Jones Act podcast, so. I know Puerto Ricans tend to have strong opinions on this. So
yeah, definitely. I'll keep us on track on the status issue, though. Basically what we had once, Puerto Ricans were made United States citizens is a very clear sense of, okay, so now we're, citizens of this country. We want, full participation in it. And the first statehood admission bills, I think, were introduced in the 1930s after resolutions were passed in the legislature in Puerto Rico. The Jones-Shafroth Act also made the Senate in Puerto Rico locally elected, so you kind of increased democratic representation, but we still had a presidentially appointed governor. So, there was a process where kind of more local decision making was being given to the people of Puerto Rico, but still, they were still facing unequal treatment. And obviously, that was around the time of the First World War, so Puerto Ricans, now citizens, were then also, drafted to serve in the U.S. military. Fascinating piece of history, though. The main driver of the push to give citizenship to the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico on the island was a labor leader by the name of Santiago Iglesias Pantin. And he was the leader of the Socialist Party in Puerto Rico, who was forming a coalition government with the Republican Statehood Party. So it's fascinating that Republicans and Socialists were actually kind of working together because they both believed in statehood for Puerto Rico. And they both believed in U.S. citizenship for the people of Puerto Rico. And their main ally stateside was none other than Samuel Gompers, which is a fascinating piece of history that most Americans are just not aware of. And Gompers really was critical in pushing efforts in Congress and with the president at the time for citizenship to happen. But once we were granted citizenship, the question came up to the Supreme Court, because they're citizens, does that mean that they're, on track to become a state and that they should have, full federal voting rights? And former President William Howard Taft was then a Supreme Court justice and had been the governor of the Philippines, and unfortunately was, deeply racist himself, issued a decision in an infamous case called Balzac, where he basically kind of disconnected the acquisition of citizenship with the intention of Congress to actually fully incorporate, so make, a territory a formal part of the United States, which would eventually lead to statehood. So that kind of left us in this limbo. And for the longest time, Puerto Rico politics has centered around this issue of how to resolve the territory status, with the three main traditional parties being the Puerto Rican Independence Party, which has always been a very small minority party. I think they hit their maximum electoral success in the 1920s or 30s with like 20-some% of voter support. The party that ended up eventually becoming the dominant party for most of the 20th century in Puerto Rico, which is Popular Democratic Party, and they supported having more autonomy and more local self-government under the so-called Commonwealth. So they wanted to increase the local powers that you could have as a territory. And then there was this coalition that eventually became the New Progressive Party, which is the pro-statehood party on the island that's always supported full equality and democracy through statehood.
Well, so I want to ask about those kind of camps specifically in the context of different votes and referendums that have happened in Puerto Rico over the years, because this has happened a number of times where the statehood question is put to a vote in Puerto Rico. It's happened for several decades. I think it goes all the way back to the 90s, maybe even before. I probably haven't researched it enough. But what do we know about public opinion in Puerto Rico about statehood from the result of these votes? What is the, over the last few decades, what has been the dominant view? How has it changed over time? Are there like shifting demographics of this? And what are we at right now in terms of public opinion?
So Puerto Rico in 1952, Congress allowed it to establish its own constitution, kind of local self-government, as if it were a state with its own governor, own legislature that's fully elected, its own Supreme Court. It's basically, for all practical purposes, at the local level, governs itself as if it were a state. But they called it the Commonwealth. And for a lot of people, they thought that Puerto Rico had stopped being a territory, but the Supreme Court has made clear that that's not the case. And there was a lot of people, even back then, that realized that the so-called Commonwealth was deficient, that it didn't give you the rights to have voting members of Congress, and that was really important, that it didn't give you the right to vote for president, and that was really important. And it didn't give you equality under federal laws. So in 1967 was the first time that voters in Puerto Rico were asked about their views on what future political status options they wanted. And since then, there have been 5 additional plebiscites on Puerto Rico's political status, with the most recent and significant ones being the one in 2012, 2017, and 2020. And in that, series, which has been basically over the last decade, every single time that voters in Puerto Rico have been asked, a majority of voters have rejected their the possibility of continuing under the current territory status. And among the non-territorial status options that are viable under the U.S. Constitution, which are only statehood, independence, and a form of independence called free association, every single time, more voters have supported statehood than any other non-territory option. And in 2020, there was a vote that was held just on the question of statehood by itself, right? And it was statehood, yes or no, which is the same question that was asked in Hawaii and Alaska in 1958, before they became states in 1959. And in that vote in 2020, almost 53% of voters say yes to having Puerto Rico immediately become a state of the union. So that's kind of where we've at for a long time. People thought that the Commonwealth or territory status was the best thing, but what we've seen is as more and more people have left the island, more and more people have Puerto Rican family members stateside and have learned about the benefits of being a state. Support for statehood on the island has grown.
Yeah, it's just kind of doing a naive look from my perspective at it's tough to judge these because there's so many different shifting options. Some of the votes have independence as an option and some don't. Some include Commonwealth or they have a none of the above option. And so you have this complicated thing where it's tough to compare the votes 1-to-1, right?
Definitely.
But what I do is I'm just let's just look at the percent who say they want statehood and ignore all the rest of it. What percent people vote for statehood as a first option? It seems like it's increasing over time, at least a little bit. Like in 1967, 39% said statehood. In the 90s, it was more like 46%, I think. And in 2020, I think it was like 53% said statehood.
Yeah, that's right.
So I wonder, it seems to be increasing over time a little bit, not like a tidal wave. Are there demographics to this? Are there,
Definitely.
Is it younger people have a different opinion than older people? Is there a different opinion from people who've lived on the mainland versus not?
So I think one of the biggest challenges that there is that the majority of people who support statehood have actually been voting with their feet. As United States citizens, we don't need to get a visa or get a green card to move stateside. We use our driver's license or government issued ID. We get on a airplane, buy a one-way ticket to any state of the union, and as soon as we establish residency anywhere in the states, we are automatically eligible for full equality under all federal laws and benefits and programs, and then we're also eligible to vote at the federal level, to vote for president, to vote for our senators, to vote for our representatives in Congress. So what you have, interestingly enough, is a growth in the statehood movement, but a lot of people who support that option have also kind of left the island. Age-wise, we have a dynamic where a lot of younger people, especially nowadays, are just very dissatisfied with the leadership of the major political parties locally. So they're kind of looking for, other alternatives, other ideas. There's a lot more energy, particularly in the university level, more liberal, young progressive activists for the possibility of free association or independence. And what you see is as people age, as they mature, and especially, our older voters, they tend to support statehood a lot more because they've kind of seen the consequences of some of the choices that other countries in the region have made with independence, and they've also heard a lot of the benefits of statehood by coming stateside or being in contact with their family members that are living stateside that are prospering a lot more than the folks on the island. So that's one of the interesting dynamics that's going on right now.
Yeah, and I mean, those differences are important, and we should spend some time getting into those because we've set up a lot of context here. We've talked about the history, we've talked about public opinion in Puerto Rico, but as you said, there's real differences here. This is not a question of just, low stakes. This is not some theoretical thing that, it would be nice to be recognized, but there are real, actual implications here.
Definitely.
In terms of the culture, the economy. So this is kind of a very broad question. You can take it where you'd like, but what have been the impacts of the territorial status of Puerto Rico, that it is a territory of the United States and not a state How has that impacted Puerto Ricans?
So, we talked about the decrease in population, and that's huge. That's kind of like the macro indicator that something is massively wrong, because if current territory status were wonderful, people would be staying. In fact, people would be flocking to come to Puerto Rico. And right now, the only people who are coming to flock to Puerto Rico are people who are, seeking to avoid paying federal taxes under local tax exemption laws that were passed. But otherwise, a lot of people who are productive, have families, want to develop their future, they're moving stateside. And the reason is because as a territory, Congress has the capacity to treat Puerto Rico unequally under federal laws and programs, and they do so in a number of different ways. For example, Puerto Rico gets different and lower levels of support for Medicare and Medicaid, as well as for hospitals. So that means that overall in Puerto Rico, your access to health care is significantly lower in quality and availability and accessibility than it is stateside. A ton of our doctors in Puerto Rico, which have been trained on the island or fully bilingual, are also being recruited by hospitals stateside who value incredibly not only their great education and their talent, but also their bilingual capacity, and are offering them sometimes 2 to 3 times more salary to come stateside to service the populations in states where there's growing Hispanic and bilingual populations that need medical services. In Puerto Rico, we get treated differently under our federal highway program, for example. So you have more potholes on the road. Our infrastructure is less developed than it is in a lot of places stateside, because we get unequal treatment there. Puerto Ricans have disabilities and who are elderly. They receive less support, for example, in a program from the Social Security Administration called Supplementary Security Income. Puerto Ricans who are blind, disabled, and elderly, they get less funding in their Social Security checks. So the rate of poverty among the elderly in Puerto Rico is higher than it is stateside. We get less nutritional assistance in Puerto Rico. So you have more families with young children that have higher rates of malnutrition because they don't get the same access to SNAP that most people stateside get access to, and all of that leads to a cumulative underinvestment in the economy in Puerto Rico that frankly limits the capacity for the jurisdiction to compete at an equal playing field with the states and fully develop itself.
There's an interesting kind of like Puerto Rico sits in this in-between space in my head, because if you look at it in the context of Caribbean islands, Puerto Rico is far and away the most economically successful.
Most definitely, yeah.
GDP, and it's because of, it's part of the United States. It's very obvious why that is. It's not because Puerto Ricans are magically more intelligent than Cubans or Jamaicans or Dominicans or whatever the case may be. It's, there's no magical racial thing going on. It's just, it's part of the United States. And so their GDP per capita is just much, much higher than any of those kind of peer nations, if you want to think of it that way. But if you think of Puerto Rico as a state, then it would be either at the very bottom or near the bottom in most metrics, whether you're talking about quality of healthcare or GDP or infrastructure or whatever the case may be. So it's interesting how it sits in that space where it, which I guess is the political status too. It sits in this in-between space where it's not an independent nation, but it's not a state, and it's something else.
That's right. That's right. We are a territory of the United States. From the constitutional perspective, Congress has something called plenary powers, so they can essentially not only govern us at the federal level, but since we don't have the same protections of sovereignty, of the rights that states get to reserve to themselves, then Congress also has the capacity to govern us at the local level. And for a long time, Congress authorized Puerto Rico since 1953, as I mentioned earlier, to have its own local governor, its own local legislature, its own local Supreme Court, and to govern itself on local matters, right? But that changed in 2016 when, because of a fiscal crisis and a debt crisis that Puerto Rico was going through, in large part because since Puerto Rico receives unequal treatment under federal laws and programs, the government of Puerto Rico was trying to compensate for that by borrowing more money and then trying to, raise the standard of living on the island so that, people would stay and wouldn't leave, right? But that eventually all came to a head in 2014 and 2015. And then Congress stepped in and passed a law to allow for Puerto Rico's debt restructuring. But in that law, which is called Promesa, they also created a fiscal oversight and management. And this is a group of 7 individuals that are appointed by the president and Congress, and they are unelected. And they not only have the capacity to supervise Puerto Rico's finances, but they actually have the capacity to overturn local laws passed by the elected governor and the elected, legislature in Puerto Rico, and nullify those laws if they're not in accordance with the established and approved fiscal plans that they're the ones who have the capacity to approve. So what does that mean? That means that Puerto Rico today not only has this huge democratic deficit at the federal level, where Congress every day can pass laws that impact us, and we don't have a voting member who can vote on the floor of the House or vote on the floor in the Senate, and we can't vote for president, which is obviously the one that executes the federal laws, but we also have a democratic deficit at the local level, because even though we elect our local governor, we elect the state, legislature in Puerto Rico, this unelected oversight board can essentially overturn the laws that are approved by our locally elected officials. And that's essentially colonialism. There's no real other way to say that.
If Puerto Rico did become a state, do you think it would be a positive impact on the local economy? And this seems like an obvious, like you can just obviously shout, yes, next question. But I'm curious, like how that would happen, because obviously, like Puerto Rico has a lower GDP than most other U.S. states. It traditionally has always had a higher unemployment rate than the national average. What are some things that you think would be like immediate benefits? Would it just be kind of the programmatic stuff that, we'll get paid for highways and Social Security at the fair rate now that every other state gets? Or would it be more stuff like, we would get more investment, more industries would come here, if we had statehood, and it would just be, we would have more long-term growth. What do you see as the actual like concrete impact if this were to happen?
So the reality is that Puerto Rico as a territory, along with every other territory of the United States, which I think deserve to be mentioned. So the other United States territories are Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. Collectively, all of the U.S. territories are economically underperforming. And this is not just unique to the current United States territory. It's also a reality that happened in former United States territory, like Alaska and Hawaii, were obviously the last 2 states that were territories that got admitted into the Union, and then some of the other territories. And what we see is that under territory status, you have an economic underperformance because there's a vulnerability to the reality that you don't have voting members of Congress that can fully advocate for the needs, interests, and the vision of what the people there want to do with their jurisdiction. But you also have the challenge that at any point Congress can use this plenary power to, change any rules, any regulations, any, federal programs or laws and how they apply to the territory. And that creates an economic uncertainty that becomes a disincentive for investment. So what's fascinating is when we look at the economy of Alaska, Hawaii, Arizona, New Mexico, some of the more recently admitted states, all of them experience a phenomenon called economic convergence, where over the next decade or 2 decades after statehood admission, you have a increase in economic growth that is very significant and above what they experienced as a territory, because they're essentially coming into alignment with the kind of national average of the rate of economic growth. And we expect that Puerto Rico would have the same thing.
I think Hawaii is really interesting there, just because, I could imagine someone saying, well, look, Puerto Rico's always going to be poorer than us because they're an island and they're separated. There's physical geographic challenges, and they don't have oil on the island or anything. And so, yeah, I feel bad for them, but this isn't statehood. This is just geography. And okay, that's on its face. That's a reasonable argument, right? It's not ridiculous out of hand. But if you look at Hawaii, it's very interesting because Hawaii is not the poorest state in the union. Hawaii is dead middle. While we were talking, I looked it up. Hawaii is 25th out of 50. So I think that kind of proves that, and Hawaii is in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, it literally the most isolated place on earth. So if Hawaii can reach kind of average income for a state, it certainly seems like there's no reason why Puerto Rico couldn't.
Definitely. And I think the reasons for that are multiple. So one is, when you become a state, you automatically get treated equally under all federal laws and programs. And there's a cumulative effect to that increased federal investment, because you're going to improve the quality of healthcare. You're going to improve the amount of, infrastructure and the quality of infrastructure on the island. You're going to improve the amount of income that, indigent people receive, and all of that essentially increases the velocity of money on the island, and essentially leads to higher rates of economic growth, and it basically unleashes the economic growth potential in the economy, which is right now in Puerto Rico undercapitalized. Right. The other piece is you increase the certainty of businesses seeking to make long-term investments in the jurisdiction, because they know how states get treated. They know that, you have, 2 senators, and, Puerto Rico would possibly have, 4 representatives that they can talk to if there's an issue that's specific to, their business, needs on the island when Congress is passing legislation that impacts them. And right now, all that they have is, a resident commissioner. I worked for a former resident commissioner, the current governor. And, it was devastating. We had, 4 times as many constituents as any other member of the House. Yet we had the capacity to, speak about issues on the floor, to vote in committee. But whenever any issue came up for a vote, we couldn't vote. And you represent 4 times, more people than any other member on the floor, and yet you can't be counted for any vote. That's devastating.
This is something we have actually had on the podcast before. Representative Stacey Plaskett, who is from the U.S. Virgin Islands.
That's right.
And this is something we talked about, how frustrating it is that she tries to make a difference. She's talking with members. She's on the floor. She's debating with people and convincing people, and she can vote in committee, as you said. She can actually make a difference in the committees she's in, and her vote counts. But once a bill comes to the floor, that's it. She doesn't get to do anything.
That's right. And the impact of that is really challenging, because you don't have as many staff. You can't develop as much seniority. There's been no territory member that has risen to the chairman of any of the main committees in Congress ever. And then you have no representation in the United States Senate, which is, incredibly, incredibly challenging, because you basically have to go and beg other senators from other states to support your issues. And there's a lot of, great senators out there. But unfortunately, when it comes to deciding whether or not to push the issues that impact their constituents that vote for them, or to do something to help Puerto Rico out, even the best intentioned senators are always going to go for, giving priority to the issues that impact their voters over the issues that impact the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico.
So we've made kind of a case here for why this would be a good thing. And it seems obvious to me that statehood would have a lot of benefits. But it is interesting that, again, this doesn't receive massive support on the island. It's got to a point where it seems like it's a slight majority, but it is not the case that, 80 to 90% of Puerto Ricans are just so clearly in favor of statehood. What are the arguments against? And I'm kind of asking you to argue against your own, organizations, what you do. But like, what are the principled objections to this? What's the case against, even if you don't personally buy into it?
There's a bunch of reasons why the percentage of voters in support of statehood isn't significantly higher. And I think the biggest reason is because all of the plebiscites that have happened have been locally sponsored. And as a result, you have the capacity of a whole bunch of people who kind of oppose whichever, government majority at the time approves the plebiscite to basically say, hey, this is just something they're doing to get people to come out to vote. It's insignificant. It doesn't matter. So don't participate, right? So there's a huge issue there. And we actually did a video series on the issue of election denial in Puerto Rico, which is fascinating, and I highly recommend that your audience go check us out on YouTube. It's PR50 is the name of our YouTube channel, because we talk about that, and there's significant issue there. But getting back to the issues of why some people oppose statehood for Puerto Rico, a lot of it is fear. They're afraid that if Puerto Rico becomes a state, that, we'll lose our culture, we'll lose our identity. And I understand that. I understand and have compassion for that sense of not wanting to lose the unique identity and culture that Puerto Rico has. And the reality is, I look at Puerto Rican community stateside as kind of living proof of the fact that you don't need to stop being Puerto Rican to have, full equality and full rights. Look at the Puerto Rican Day Parade. Look at the Puerto Rican festivals in Florida happening every single year. Look at the amount of, people studying traditional arts that are Puerto Rican in community stateside, whether that's Bomba y Plena, which is a traditional Afro-Puerto Rican dance, or, continuing to follow other traditions like, celebrating Three Kings Day after Christmas. Whether you're in San Juan, in, Orlando, in New York, or, elsewhere in the world, you continue to carry your Puerto Ricanness with you. And there's nothing in federal laws that either requires Puerto Rico to stop having Spanish be its dominant language, because there is no official language at the national level. And there's multiple states that have, English and other languages as their official languages. And there's nothing in federal law that limits the capacity of, Puerto Ricans to exercise their cultures, to continue, eating rice and beans and listening to, whether salsa, merengue, reggaeton, whatever it is that you like. We're going to continue being an island in the Caribbean. We're going to continue being Caribbean people. We're going to continue being, having a rich Hispanic heritage and culture. And I think that in the United States, that really lives up to its value of a pluribus unum, out of many one. Puerto Rico can have full equality and full democracy, and also add in its own unique flavor, the same way that Texas clearly has a very proud and distinct state identity. Louisiana, New Orleans, right? There's many places across the United States that have a very significant, well-developed cultural identity. So I think that's one of the arguments that a lot of the opponents hang on to. And I understand where they're coming from. A lot of people also kind of are afraid of the possibility of having to pay federal taxes. It scares them because it's something that's unknown. They're not sure how it'll work. And frankly, among the people that are doing well in Puerto Rico, a lot of them are doing well in a way where they're not paying federal income taxes on the income derived on the island. And it scares them to have to pay that income. But for the vast majority of people on the island, middle class, working class, people who are more indigent, statehood would vastly improve their standard of living. And, it's my personal opinion that, rising tide lifts all boats. So, let's improve the living circumstance for the vast majority of people on the island. And, if the people on the upper end need to pay some more taxes to have a place that is, has better health care, where people drive on better roads, where, our elderly and disabled people are better taken care of, that's a fair trade-off, in my view.
One of the things you mentioned there early on was that you think that the ways that the referendums or the plebiscites are held potentially influences the vote. Do you think that the result would be different if there was an actual, this is the real thing, this will be enforced, you are voting yes or no, and this will happen? Do you think that the votes would be different than the kind of very closely contested results we've seen before? Because most of the votes for the past few years, where people have, the well-participated ones have been 50-50-ish, close to 50-50. Do you think that would change if it was everybody knew this is the real thing?
Most definitely. There's no question about that. And history proves this out, right? So when both Alaska and Hawaii were territories and they were seeking admission into the Union, they held locally sponsored votes, and statehood won. But when Congress passed binding legislation with an actual offer of admission and then requested that the residents of the territory ratify that decision to become a state by answering yes or no vote, and if people voted yes, Hawaii and Alaska would be admitted. You saw not only the rates of participation increase, but the amount of people voting for statehood increased significantly as well. Why? Because people had confidence that what they were voting for was actually going to be honored. And that's why in the work that my organization does, Puerto Rico Statehood Council and PR51st.com, which is our website, people can find more information about the advocacy work that we do there. We've been supporting legislation that essentially Congress recognizes the inherent problems with the current territory status and then offers voters in Puerto Rico a definitive choice among the non-territory status options, be that statehood, independence, or independence with free association. I obviously support statehood. I'm confident that the majority of voters would choose that. But, you have to let the democratic process play out. And I'm open to having whatever the people choose, be what's implemented, because ultimately that's what democracy is about. We have to, present voters with the choices and then, respect the will of the majority of voters. And in 2022, that proposed piece of legislation was actually approved in the U.S. House of Representatives. With a unanimous vote by the Democratic House members, and 16 Republican House members joined that bill to get it passed on a bipartisan basis. And this was just a couple weeks before Congress changed hands to Republican control. So getting 16 Republican members was nearly miraculous. And it shows that
I wonder, were those 16 Republicans, were any of them retiring and we're out, so we don't care anymore? Well, I wonder if that's part of it. I don't know if you know, but
so some were, but some are members that are still in Congress this year. And actually, when the bill was reintroduced last year, we've gained bipartisan support in the House again.
So what do you think the partisanship is here? Because obviously the Democrats seem to support this, and look, I'm biased. This is a pro-democratic, a center-left podcast.
I got you.
I'm not going to pretend that I'm unbiased here. I have a point of view, and for me, it seems like the Democrats support this mostly as a matter of principle, that they think it's the right thing to do. The Republicans seem to be worried that it would be, well, we're just adding a democratic state, and 2 more Democratic senators. And that seems to be the objection that they have that I can see if you get beyond whatever other things they say. Do you think that would actually be accurate, though? Because I've heard conflicting reports on this, that Puerto Rico, we tend to think of Hispanic people in the U.S. as being a Democratic voting bloc. But do you think it's automatic that would happen for Puerto Rico, or would the Republican Party play very well in Puerto Rico, or like how would that go?
So this conversation's interesting because it basically takes into account kind of the assumption of what the voting outcomes for the people of Puerto Rico would be. And this happened with Alaska and Hawaii. In both cases, it was assumed that, for example, Hawaii would be a heavily Republican state and that Alaska would be a heavily Democratic state. And everyone ended up being wrong, and both states have ended up flipping and supporting the other party. In the case of Puerto Rico, I think that Puerto Rico would be a purple state. I think that it has elected both Democrats and Republicans to the governorship. As our non-voting member in Congress, our resident commissioner, it has also voted for Democrat-led state legislatures and Republican-led state legislatures. I myself, I've worked on these issues for 17 years. I've worked for 2 governors, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat. The House member that I worked for, resident commissioner Pedro Pierluisi, who's now the current governor, he's a Democrat. But our current resident commissioner, who's running against him in a primary for the governorship, she's a Republican, right? So what we see is that whichever political parties have a vision and a way of speaking to the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico that is inclusive of their actual needs, their interests, that takes them into account, that doesn't take them for granted, and that ultimately gives them the power to choose their future, that I think is the political party that is going to, reap the most benefit from, Puerto Rico's possible admission in the future. But the reality is that irrespective of what happens, Puerto Rico is inevitably going to have a significant conservative base of voters that are kind of religious and rural voters, and then also more liberal and progressive set. But the vast majority of people in Puerto Rico, I think, are kind of moderate. If I had to give you an average, I think that on average, a lot of people in Puerto Rico are kind of center left. That's my kind of general take.
Well, we welcome that. It seems interesting to me that, like, I almost think the best thing that could happen for Puerto Rico statehood is for Puerto Rico to elect some very obvious loud Republicans several times in a row, because just the Democrats are baked in at this point. They can't back out of supporting Puerto Rican statehood without really embarrassing themselves. And it would almost be like proof, like, Republicans, you can support this. This might work out for you. Like, if you just elected a bunch of Republicans in a row. That's just my wish casting, though. I don't know.
Well, I mean, but our current resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, she's a Republican. She even campaigned for Trump, in the last election cycle. And she has been the highest vote getter in Puerto Rico for 3 election cycles in a row, and is right now challenging the current governor in a primary.
Well, let's make sure the Republican Party is very aware of that fact, is I guess what I'm saying. We are coming up on time here. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we ask to every guest on this podcast. And that is, where can people go to learn more? If they're interested in learning more about, Puerto Rican history, or the statehood movement, or the issues that Puerto Rico is facing, or anything that we've been talking about here, really, what would you recommend for people to go learn more? This could be books to read. It could be people to follow on social media, a white paper report, just anything you think would be helpful for people who are interested in the subject and want to keep learning.
Well, I would highly recommend that your audience go to the website for our organization, which is pr51st.com. We post regular articles in English that analyze this issue, talk about what's happening in Congress, talk about the citizen movement that's been growing around this. Because, for a long time, this issue was kind of led mostly by just the elected officials and the political figures. But what we have right now in our organization is over 60,000 supporters nationwide, on the island, stateside, from the left, from the right, independents, that all understand that U.S. shouldn't have colonies, that the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico should have the opportunity to decide their own future. And as a result, there's great opportunities on our website to learn about this issue, but then also to actually become engaged as activists and supporters. We have tools for you to be able to send messages to your members of Congress, and also to kind of get involved more actively with our Puerto Rico Statehood Action Network, which is kind of a network of activists and activist organizations that come and meet with member offices here in Washington, D.C., write letters to Congress to advance this issue, and engage in all kinds of advocacy efforts. So, if people want to get involved, go to pr51st.com. Also check us out on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter, now X. And we'd love to, get your support and to answer any questions you may have.
Well, I find myself supporting you. I find myself thinking that this would be a good thing. And, if it was up to me, I would be on your side. Unfortunately, they haven't given me the power to unilaterally change the U.S. law and constitution. This is a flaw in the system that I'm working to correct, so.
Well, trust me, I'm working to correct that one as well. But you know what? You and everyone listening right now do have power, right? And this is one of the things that's fascinating about the work that I'm doing is, we all kind of look at this big issue. It's been around for 125 years. How do I address it? And we actually have to reclaim the power that we have. You're in New York. You can contact your senators in New York and tell them to support the Puerto Rico Status Act. It was introduced in the Senate by Senator Martin Heinrich. We've already got 23 senators on board. So folks from other states can reach out to their senators and, call for hearings on this issue, ask their members to support this legislation. That, I think, is a very powerful thing that you and everyone who's listening can do to, make your voices heard and be great allies to the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico.
Well, like I said, if they gave me the, just dictatorial power, I would do it in a heartbeat. I can only hope the democratic process will do it as well. I would also end the Jones Act. I just want to slander the Jones Act one more time before we leave. But I'm hopeful that this can see some progress. It's the kind of thing that is the work of decades, it seems like, rather than the work of months or even just years. But hopefully we see some movement on this. I do want to thank one more time my guest for coming on the show today, George Laws Garcia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah. Have a great day.